Hola y bienvenidos a Chalk and Talk. This week we are going back in time. We're going back to the time when we used to analyze some of our socios Spanish. Today it's a turn of Mike Gardner. Not to be confused with Mick Garner, totally different. Mike Gardner, who is going to talk to us desde Segovia. Nos vemos en la segunda parte. Mike was going back through some of the old Chalk and Talk, and he said, hey, I've discovered that you actually used to do analysis of people's Spanish. Would you be willing to do an analysis of my Spanish? And I said, absolutely, I would love to. In fact, the idea of helping socios with the Spanish by analyzing them, I know it's terrifying, and you've got to have to actually un buen par, to actually do that, to send in a video and say, Gordon, what do you think of my Spanish? But I think that there are tremendous benefits from it. And you must understand that I am not going to give you a hard time. Why? I know when I was in your position learning, when people would criticize my Spanish, it was very hard for me to take because I was aware that I wasn't good, and it was like, oh my God, what are they going to say? Okay, so I understand that it's hard, but self-reflection, this kind of self-reflection, this is what it's all about, is absolutely important on the road to getting your Spanish to a great place. All right, so let's start by listening to Mike say his bit. Now, before we start, there are two sheets that we have attached to this lesson. The first one is just Mike's transcription. Right now, if you want to do this, if you want to kind of, if you think, well, hang on, my Spanish is at a better level, then you become the teacher. And your job is to download the transcription. You can listen as well, but look at the transcription and you are going to mark that as though you were a teacher. And you're going to say, okay, well, I don't think that's correct, or I would say this. All right. And then you're going to be able to balance that against what I say. And obviously what Cynthia says as well. Cynthia's added some things to this that I missed. So let's see how we do. Now, by this point, Mike is probably like this. He's probably got no nails left. Oh my goodness, what's Gordon going to say? So let's have a listen first of all to Mike in his presentation.
Hola Gordon, buenos días. Gracias por la oportunidad de charlar contigo en español. Es muy difícil para mí. Soy Miguel y vivíamos en Murcia, en un pueblo pequeño en el medio de la nada. Se llama Calaspara, muy famoso para el arroz. Ahora vivimos muy cerca de nuestra ciudad. En España se llama Segovia. El pueblo se llama Santo Domingo de Perón. Es muy, muy preciosa por aquí. Mira, mira. Ok. Mi español es un naufragio y nunca he aprendido a hablar español en la clase de profesores, solo vosotros. He aprendido a hablar español solo de otras personas españolas. Era periodista, entonces mi conocimiento de gramática inglesa es más o menos bien. He pasado mucho tiempo con personas jóvenes. Mi español es como en la calle, no en el libro. Segovia es absolutamente buenísima. El acueducto, cochinillo, la catedral, el alcázar. Nos encanta vivir aquí. Pero lo importante es sin duda la gente. la gente por aquí, la gente en toda parte de España es muy maja, relajada, servicial en cualquier sitio. Gordon, gracias por la oportunidad. Espero que puedas entenderme. Tengo que volver a mi casa con mi perrito aquí. Gracias. Gordon, eres un profesor muy bueno. Eres un profesor muy bueno de cojones. Eres el sol. Eres la pera limonera. Eres la leche. Eres el puto amo. Gracias. Adios, Gordon.
First things. Now, I don't know what you think about Mike's presentation, but I think that it was excellent for one reason, the principal reason. And the principal reason is this, that I understood every single thing that he wanted to say. There was at no point was there any confusion. Now, if we look at Spanish learning a language on a global level, that's what it's all about. I mean, we're in the hokey-cokey land. That's what it's all about. If you can communicate and you can talk to somebody and that person understands every single thing that you have wanted to communicate, you're there. You've arrived, have you not? Now, obviously, you want it to be correct. You know, you want to dot the I's and cross the T's, but that's not what communication is about. Communication is about they say the value of communication or the measure of communication is the reaction that your communication elicits. It's the understanding. It isn't the saying. So you can say something really well, like correctly grammatically, and people don't understand you. So Mike's a communicator, as you saw in his speech. He was periodista. How do you say that in English? Not coming to me. He was a reporter. Okay, and he's written things. Mike has written a book on his Camino de Santiago. I recommend it. I'll see if I can get the link in this as well, so you can get it. It's a beautiful story. His day-to-day experiences on the Camino de Santiago. So, sorry, not to get sidetracked. So, communication, fine, absolutely spot on. There was not one moment when I didn't understand. Okay, so now that's the good. That's the best. Really, you can't ask for any more than that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the nitty-gritty of it. All right, it's going to seem like a lot, but when you juxtapose that against the fact that everything was understandable, then it isn't a lot. It's just bits and pieces. What we've done is what I've done is I've highlighted everything. Okay, so it might seem like a lot, but it isn't. So let's start. I'm trying to soften this for you, Mike, so you don't feel like I'm bombarding you, okay? But let's go through it. So let's have a look at the very first line that he says, the first couple of lines. Right, let's have a listen to that.
Hola, Gordon. Buenos días. Gracias por la oportunidad charlar contigo en español. Es muy difícil para mí.
What he says is, gracias por la oportunidad charlar. Now, all that's missing from there is the preposition de. Es la oportunidad de charlar. And it's always that. It's always the opportunity. We would say the opportunity to talk, and that's where we fall into the trap, because to talk is charlar, no, hablar. So we just think, well, we'll just stick that together. But no, in Spanish, there is the opportunity of to talk. That's how they say it, right? Okay, so did you get that when you were looking at it? Did you notice that it should have a de there? If you did, excellent. You get 1 point. All right, so, and if you didn't, bear that in mind, that when you say oportunidad de, yeah, and then remember, you've added de, that's a preposition, so the verb has to be in its infinitive. De charlar, de hablar. de platicar, if you wanted to use from Mexico. Okay? Next one. Let's have a look at the next line and we'll see what did you notice and what have I noticed.
Soy Miguel y vivíamos en Murcia en un pueblo pequeño en el medio de la nada, se llama Calaspara, muy famoso para el arroz.
Okay, so Mike used an expression, in the middle of nowhere. Okay, he said we lived in Murcia in the middle of nowhere. And what he said was en el medio de la nada. The el is not necessary. They say en medio de la nada, en medio, in the middle. We would say in the middle, and obviously that's where Mike's getting that from. He's thinking in the English form, in the middle, but they say in middle of the nothing. In middle of the nothing, that's what they say, en medio de la nada. Okay? Now, the other bit is this. When we'll say, I lived in a little village in the middle of nowhere called, all right? And called, then whatever it's called, the Calasparra, okay? But the Spanish don't say called. That would be nombrado or llamado. And no. What they do, they say that calls itself, okay? And so for that reason, when you can't say en medio de la nada se llama, okay? Unless it was a new sentence, you're going to say que se llama. Que se llama, because you're not saying called, you're saying that calls itself, right? So that sentence would be en un pueblo en medio de la nada que se llama. Now, the other thing is, because Mike said vivíamos en Murcia, we used to live, that my temptation would be to say, rather than que se llama, que se llamaba. Okay? It's optional, that's called, that was called, we lived in this place, that was called. Typically in English, if we say we lived in this place, that was called, that tends to be the way. But either way, I wouldn't give you a bad mark for that. I would just say, maybe I would have said que se llamaba. Okay? Now, that is very famous for rice. Okay? Now, being famous for something is being famous because of something. Now, does that help you between por and para? Being famous because of something, which happens to be their rice, that's going to be por rather than para. So, muy famoso por, and I would say su arroz, because it's their rice. Yeah, that they're famous for, their rice, rather than el arroz, which is rice in general. Yeah, so it's a bit more pertinent to them. That's why we would say, that's what happens in Spanish when you make it pertinent to a place rather than the generic. Quite often you'll use the possessive adjective. Okay. All right, so let's have a look at the next one.
Ahora vivimos muy cerca de nuestra ciudad. En España se llama Segovia. El pueblo se llama Santo Domingo de Perón. Es muy, muy preciosa por aquí. Mira.
All right, so Mike says, ahora vivimos en nuestra, and then he corrects himself. That's standard. Everybody, I do it, Cynthia does it, everybody does it. We start a sentence, we stop, we backtrack, because we realize it's not what we want to say. All right, that's got nothing to do with commanding language. That is just the way that people speak. So he says, muy cerca nuestra ciudad en España. All right? So we're missing a preposition. It's always cerca de. Muy cerca de. Right? So muy cerca de nuestra ciudad en España. Que se llama. Again, que se llama. All right? We've already mentioned why. Que se llama Segovia. Now that sentence, perhaps if I were going to reshuffle that around, because it's a little bit unclear, maybe better would be ahora vivimos muy cerca de Segovia. Ahora vivimos muy cerca de Segovia. That's an option as well. Okay, so Mike says el pueblo se llama Santo Domingo, and that's fine. You don't need a que there because it's just a sentence on its own. But then he says, es muy, muy preciosa por aquí. Now, that sentence is fine. Se entiende. It's a bit English, the structure of that sentence, which is not surprising because Mike's English. Okay. Probably it would be better to say es una zona muy preciosa. Okay. Es una zona rather than es muy preciosa por aquí. It isn't something that would be typically said. Okay. So es una zona muy preciosa, or something like that. And then he says mira, and he lets us see. Yeah. Now, because he's talking to me, and because he said hello, hola Gordon, he's talking to me, so he's using mira. Obviously, if he was talking to an audience, he might say mirar. Yeah, but because he's talking to me, mira. Okay? All right, so let's have a look at the next bit.
Okay. Mi español es un naufragio y nunca he aprendido a hablar español en la clase de profesores, solo vosotros. He aprendido a hablar español solo de otras personas españolas.
Mike starts off with saying okay twice. Now, it's interesting that although I hear it just every now and again, but not very often, okay is not used in Spain. It's used in Latin America. I've heard it there, absolutely. In Spain, they tend not to say okay. I've heard it. I'm just saying they tend not to. Typically, for what he wants to say is like, right, I'm going to start something new. Okay, like this, yeah. A nice option would be bueno pues. Okay, that's very, very standard here in Spain. Bueno pues, and it's just a way of starting off your sentence. It doesn't mean anything. It's like well then. Doesn't mean anything, but that's what they would say. And he says, mi español es un naufragio. Okay, my Spanish is a shipwreck. Okay, sometimes people say a car crash, don't they? That isn't something that would be said here in Spain. I think it's a very metaphorical type of way. They tend not to say things. For example, I ran that by Cynthia and she said, well, I understand it, but it sounds a bit weird, like a bit forced. And that's because that's kind of how we like to speak it's a shipwreck. And we like that kind of metaphorical language. They're not so metaphorical here in Spain. They're a lot more literal in many, many ways. And so, for example, an option would be, mi español es un catástrofe. It's a catastrophe. Yeah? That would probably be more likely to be kind of listened to without any kind of, that's strange. Yeah? Okay? So, catástrofe. Right, and then he says, y nunca he aprendido a hablar. Nunca he aprendido a hablar. Now, aprender, the verb, has the preposition. Anyone who's done the preposition book will know this. A. It's always aprender a. Okay? Enseñar a, aprender a. So when you say that, you've got to say, nunca he aprendido a hablar. Even though sometimes you don't hear it because they say, nunca he aprendido a hablar. So it's like carried on onto the a of the hablar, but it's longer a, so that's how you know it's there. Okay? Hablar español en la clase. De profesoras. Okay, so what Mike wants to say there is, I've never learned my Spanish in a class with teachers. What I would say there is, hablar español en la clase con, right? Con and profesores. I wouldn't use profesoras because that would assume that there were only women that ever taught Spanish, but generally, yeah? So con profesores. All right, so, and then he says, solo vuestro, and then he realizes, he backtracks as we all do, and he solo vosotros. And again, because we've used con, this happens, you'll see this in with prepositions. When we've used a preposition and then we continue that sentence using the same verb that triggers off the preposition, then we tend to use the preposition again, yeah? So, solo con vosotros, yeah? And then he says, he aprendido a hablar, again, aprender a. And it's worthwhile recording this and recording it, remembering this, recordarlo, in your mind, because we use hablar a lot. We use aprender a lot because we're always talking about what we've learned, yeah, and that we learn Spanish. So it's worthwhile remembering that aprender a do something, okay? So, he aprendido a hablar español solo de otras personas españolas. So he's only learned to speak from other Spanish-speaking people. That's where he's learned his Spanish, okay? And it's interesting because there are a couple of things that I hear him do that makes me think that he's learned by ear in Murcia. Okay, so let's have a look at the next bit. Let's have a listen.
Era periodista, entonces mi conocimiento de gramática inglesa es más o menos bien. And so he pasado mucho tiempo con personas jóvenes. Mi español es como en la calle, no en el libro, en el libro.
He starts by saying, era periodista, and he's talking about himself. Now, what I would suggest is, because the last sentence that he said before that was with other Spanish people, okay? And then he says, era periodista. I would prefer to say yo era periodista, just for clarity, because era, remember, can be he, she, it, you, usted, lots of different things, and yo. So in that sense, I would probably use yo. It's optional, you don't need to, but there you are. But I remember as I listened to it the first time, I thought, era periodista, who's he referring to? Oh yes, him. Yeah, so there was that moment of, I'm not sure who you're talking about. Okay? And then he says, entonces, mi conocimiento de gramática. Right, now this is the first clue that Mike has learned his Spanish in Murcia, because they don't say mi conocimiento, they say mis conocimientos. Okay, so they tend to make conocimientos plural. But of course, in Murcia, you're never going to hear mis conocimientos. You're going to hear mi conocimiento. Okay, but really it's got an S on. They won't say that in Murcia because they drop the endings off. So that makes absolute sense to me that you would say that. Okay, so because mis conocimientos is plural, then you've got to say son. Okay, son. However, he says son más o menos bien. Okay, but here we've got the problem. Ser bien. That's what he's used. It's not allowed in Spanish. It's the only one, ser bien, that is never used, ever. And so it's always got to be ser bueno. So that would be mis conocimientos de gramática son más o menos buenos. Okay? So you have to, obviously, because I changed the mi conocimiento, okay, he said es, that agreed with his thing, but obviously because the plural you've got to say son. But son can't go with bien. Remember the rule. Ser bueno, estar bien. Okay, and then you can have estar bueno when you're talking about sexy or tasty. Okay, so a couple of times Mike has started with so, and that's just because he's English, and that's how we start sentences. So an option would be así que, entonces, así que. But obviously it comes out because our minds doing this translation, and we want to fill it, and so we use so. But you can use así que again. That's a nice little filler that doesn't mean anything. Pues, that's another one. You can just use any. Bueno, pues, así que, entonces. Entonces was a big one for me. I don't know if I still use it a lot, but boy did I used to use that a lot. Too much. So he says he spends a lot of time with young people, and he says, mi español es como en la calle. Okay? Es como en la calle. What he wants to say is, I have street Spanish. Yeah, Spanish from the street. I would say, mi español es de la calle. Or tengo un español de la calle, of the street. Yeah, rather than, or es, you could say, mi español es como el de la calle. if you wanted to do that. That's a bit more complex, the one of the street. But you can just say, mi español es de la calle. All right? Y no en el libre, it says libre, and he corrects himself and says libro. I would say rather than in the book, I would say de un libro, from a book. Yeah, which is what we would say as well. That's what he wanted to say. I think it just came out not from the book, but not from a book. Yeah? All right. So, let's have a look at the next bit.
Segovia es absolutamente buenísima. El acueducto, cochinillo, la catedral, el alcázar. Nos encanta vivir aquí. Pero lo importante es sin duda la gente. La gente por aquí, la gente en toda parte de España es muy, muy maja, muy maja. Relajada, servicial, en cualquier sitio.
So in the next bit, Mike says, Segovia es absolutamente buenísima. Okay. Se entiende perfectamente bien. The issue with ser bueno is really you're talking about a characteristic. Like, it's really good. It's a really well-behaved city. That's kind of what you're saying. So rather than buenísima, I would probably use something like fantástica. Es absolutamente fantástica. Rather than avoid ser bueno when you just want to say it's good, like nice, good, great. That's not what you want to do, because that's talking more like it's a good city as in it behaves itself well, yeah? And then he does a list of el acueducto, cochinillo, put the el on. When you're doing a list like that, el acueducto, el cochinillo, la catedral, okay? That's what they do. They'll put the word in. There's a place that Atazar, I think, and I've written it down as Cazar. It's not Cazar, but I don't know. I don't know Segovia that well, so I don't know what the word is. I think it's Atazar, but I might be wrong. Okay? And then Mike says, but the important thing is, without doubt, the people. And the people around here are wonderful. Mike likes Spanish people, and this is Mike is probably one of the most enthusiastic people that I've ever spent time talking to. He's enthusiastic about life. When you talk to him, it's palpable. He just loves life. He loves people. He loves talking. He loves experiencing new things. So he's a nice guy, and he likes people. And so he says, la gente en toda parte de España. Now this is another signal that he's been brought up in Murcia, because it's en todas partes de España. En todas partes. But if he's learned it from the street with young people, he's not going to hear todas partes in Murcia. It's going to be en toda parte. Okay? So that's why he's saying that. I'm assuming, anyway. And then he says, the people in Spain are muy maja. Maja. Okay? Maja is a word from Spain, and it's really good people. Nice people. Great people. Maja. Gente maja. Yeah? And then he taught me a word. He said relajada, relaxed, yeah. Servicial, okay. Servicial. I haven't used that word before, and I haven't heard it before. It certainly hasn't. I probably have heard it, but it hasn't sunk in, and that's helpful as well. So that's nice. So thank you for that, for teaching me a word. En cualquier sitio, in any place, okay. So let's have a look at the last bit.
Okay, Gordon. Gracias por la oportunidad. Espero que puedas entenderme. Tengo que volver a mi casa con mi perrito aquí. So, gracias. Gordon, eres un profesor muy bueno. Eres un profesor muy bueno de cojones. Eres un eres el sol, eres la pera limonera, eres la leche, eres el puto amo. Gracias. Adios, Gordon.
All right, so Mike finishes by saying thanks for the opportunity, and then he says, espero que puedas entenderme. Subjunctive. Well done. Espero que puedas. So well done that you slipped in the subjunctive there. And then he says, tengo que volver a mi casa. I have to go home with my dog. Then he uses another so, which you could say, así que, pues, pues nada, whatever you want, really. Okay? And then he ends up saying some things about me. And he says, Gordon, eres un profesor muy bueno. So there you are. You see, ser bueno, I'm good, characteristic. Yeah, thank you for that. And then he says, eres un profesor muy bueno de cojones. Okay? So that's very colloquial. Very colloquial. And we say in the UK, you're the dog's bollocks. Okay? Now, I know they don't say that in the US, but it means you are really good. Okay? Now, that's the expression here. One thing for you, Mike, is that you don't need to put muy in there. The reason is, de cojones is the muy. It's like extremely. Right? So you don't need to add another very in there. So you just say, eres un profesor bueno de cojones. All right, so you don't have to say muy bueno. All right, bueno de cojones. And then he says, eres el sol. Now, you're the sun. Typically what they do is rather than saying el sol, they say un sol. Eres un sol. All right, you're a sun. So equally is nice. You could say el sol, but typically I hear eres un sol. All right, eres la pera limonera. Now, that's an expression that I have heard, but I've never used before. And it's just like, you know, the dog's doings, whatever you want to call it. Eres la leche, you're the milk. I do know that one, and I do use that one, and that's you're very good as well. Eres la leche. And eres el puto amo, right? That's a swear word. And basically, you're the boss. You're the effing boss, okay? So that's a nice way. A nice way to finish your thing. Thank you very much for that. So let's just look at what we've done there. I've kind of picked to pieces everything that Mike has said. But let me tell you something. If someone were to take one of my Gordon's diaries and transcribe it, they would also pick it to pieces. There would be stuff to talk about. There would be, maybe that wouldn't be the best way to say it. Maybe, you know, we're all in the same boat together. Spanish is not our language. And yet, if we transcribe a Spanish speaker talking, there will be things to mention, things to pick apart, things that don't flow right. It's just the way that we are when we talk. All right, so certainly for you, Mike, just because I've brought up some things, do not in any way take that as a criticism of your communication skills, because your communication skills are top drawer. Number one, eres el puto amo en cuanto a hablar en español. You do a really good job. I know people understand you because the stories you tell me, and this is the test, when you speak and people laugh, all right? And they're laughing with you, not at you. Okay, that's obviously very important. But I know you tell those stories. I said this and the people laughed. You control Spanish very well. And all that, what I would say is, if you imagine your Spanish as a whole, it's very solid. And all that you need to do is just fill some little holes inside of it, that's all. You just need to fill the holes, the little gaps, like the prepositions, you know, making sure you know when to use they and when to use a, stuff like that. But that's going to come with time. And the more you practice and the more you talk and the more you listen, the easier it's going to come to you. But in general, fantastic. You know, at the end of the day, when we talk, and this is what always gets me down about people who talk and are not understood. And there are many who talk and have absolutely no interest in whether somebody can understand them or not. And that's a shame, because if people don't understand what you're saying, why bother speaking in the first place? Just cállate. Cállate de una puta vez. Okay? That's the reason we speak is so that people understand. That should be the reason why we speak. Some people just speak because they just want to speak. So, but that's for another lesson. Bien. Muchísimas gracias, Mike, por estos 3 minutos nada más, ¿no? De conversación. If somebody else would like to do this, then all you need to do is send me a video of you chatting about anything you want. It can be, always make sure you talk about something that's close to your heart, because that's when you get enthusiastic about it. It's easier. Always talk about things you like. Don't try and talk about something that's really boring and dry, because that just doesn't inspire you at all. But only a 3-minute, 2 to 3 minutes of you chatting, and I will do an analysis for you as well, and give you, and big you up, and give you some feel good, as well as obviously helping you to guide you and things like that. Okay, chicos, os dejo y a ver, feliz año nuevo. Chicos, yo espero que 2021 sea algo muy diferente para todo el mundo, literalmente para todo el mundo. Os deseo felicidad y paz y un cambio radical. Y yo creo que viene ese cambio. 2021 no va a ser como 2020, para nada. Vamos a ver unos cambios muy grandes, chicos. Entonces, ánimo, todo va a salir bien. Entonces, chicos, nos vemos la próxima semana. Hasta luego.